Thank you. Thank you for having me as well to give a talk on renunciation. Which I hadn't realised has actually been quite a strong theme for me, probably since quite early on in my engagement. My very first solitary retreat was on Dartmoor. I took a tent and a week's worth of baked beans, and went out on Dartmoor. Largely, I think through a kind of slightly ill-considered idea of what renunciation might be. But that stemmed from quite an early reading that I encountered on the Dhutangas. So perhaps some of you know the Dhutangas, the 13 ascetic practices that the Buddha sanctioned, and which appear in a commentary from the Pali Canon, the Visuddhimagga of Buddhaghosa. So if you're not familiar with these, I'll give you an example of one. So this is number 13. It's the sitter's practice. The sitter's practice is undertaken with one of the following statements: I refuse lying down, or I undertake the sitter's practice. The sitter can get up in any one of the 3 watches of the night and walk up and down, for lying down is the only posture not allowed. This has 3 grades. Herein, one who is strict is not allowed a backrest, or cloth band, or binding strap, brackets to prevent falling while asleep. The medium one is allowed any one of these 3. And the mild one is allowed a backrest, a cloth band, a binding strap, a cushion, a 5-limb, and a 7-limb. A 5-limb is a chair made with 4 legs and a back. And a 7-limb is one made with 4 legs, a support for the back, and an arm support on each side. So basically an armchair. And there's even a little story about this. So they made that, it seems, for the elder Pitarbaya, brackets abaya of the chair. The elder became a non-returner and then attained nibbana. So you know, he fell asleep in his armchair and attained non-returnership and then nibbana. But you get a sense, at least with some of the stricter versions of these, and it's things like only eating in a single sitting during the day, things like not separating out the sweet food from the savoury food in your bowl, and wearing refuse rag robes. You get a sense of, or at least my initial reading of this was, this sounds really quite hardcore. It sounds maybe even a little macho, and even a bit of a stunt, a kind of pseudo-spiritual stunt, you might say, which, when I first read it, actually rather appealed. I was, at least in a kind of vicarious sense, rather than undertaking them. But I think one of the other reflections I had when I initially encountered those Dhutangas. By the way, a Dhutta is a scrupulous man. So Dhuttanga are the practices of the scrupulous man, or the scrupulous person, translated as ascetic. But I also had another response to it, which was more slightly reveling in the fact that I wasn't undertaking these various practices. Almost, kind of defiant attitude, which like sort of brandishing my loyalty cards for the various chocolatier in Oxford, that kind of thing. Wanting to live a life of luxury as well, and wanting others to collude with me in doing that. So, I'm not saying either of those attitudes are particularly good, but they were my initial attitudes, certainly to encountering the Dhutangas. But I've been studying them a bit more recently and trying to get more what the principles underlying those practices are. And if you look a bit more closely at it, what you see is that they're intended as practices practices of stillness, simplicity, and contentment. They're practices which, at least in the spheres of food, clothing, and lodgings, facilitate an attitude of stillness, simplicity, and contentment, which is a means to an end of delighting in development. So you get this word bhavana rama, which means delighting in development. So that's the kind of principle underlying it. They may appear to be, in a way, kind of stunts, which one might even feel rather superior for being able to do. But the principle is more, how do I simplify my life so as to delight in spiritual practice, to delight in the more contemplative elements of that practice. And what occurs to me is, what was occurring to me as I was reflecting on this was just how difficult I find that. In fact, how if anything, my life doesn't exemplify so much that attitude of stillness, simplicity, and contentment. Indeed, a lot of what I find myself confessing in chapter is a remorse around, in a way, the complexity of my life and the way that detracts from what I know to be possible when my life is simpler. So I'm going to talk a bit about these kinds of complexity. I'm not going to use the word complexity. In a way, that's a little bit too value neutral and a little bit too static. The word I'm going to use is prapancha, and I'm going to talk about 3 prapanchas. Prapancha it has that. I think it literally means something like spreading out or proliferating. So it's both dynamic and also it's thoroughly negative. So it's kind of got that connotation too. So three prapanchas. The first one is the prapancha of health. You could say that prapancha of health, fitness, well-being, that kind of thing. Asking myself, like, how complex does my breakfast really need to be? In order to have all the various nutrients, like a certain amount of goji berries and flaxseed and the right quantity of Brazil nuts. And I'll just ask you to examine that in your own experience of your breakfast. But certainly, diet is one element of that. Diet is very much an element of the prapancha of health. But increasingly recently, and Amalavajra is to blame for this, he introduced me to a fitness program back in Guhyaloka, which I just got obsessed by. So the idea is it's a simple fitness program. So you've got a very small number of progressions that you work through, and the idea is that you should be able to perform these progressions with the equipment available to someone in a high security US federal prison. So in other words, not a lot of equipment, and yet I kind of open my wardrobe and find a door mounted pull up bar, but that's not quite sort of tall enough, so I need a wall mounted pull up bar. I think, and then that's maybe a little bit too difficult, so. To use, so gymnastics rings, yoga mats, yoga belts, various different kinds of clothing, towels, a basketball. that comes in there as well. So even just within the 6 months that I've been doing it, I mean, I've been getting fitter, but definitely there's been this prapancha, this proliferation of exercise-related consumer goods going on. And that's not even to mention the YouTube subculture there is around calisthenics, bodyweight exercises. Things like, mostly it's the sort of competitive side. So, bodybuilder versus gymnast, one-arm pull-up competitions. And then up next, you just you get the sense of it proliferating. There's the prapancha of health. And also just realising there are so many different muscle groups you can be working, and learning about that. Then there's the prapancha of views. So I studied mathematics and philosophy at university, and so I've always had a kind of penchant for interesting ideas and concepts and views, and particularly. Encountering a discussion fora online has been a kind of bounty of those complex, interesting, sometimes dismaying views that one can encounter there. But I think where it becomes a prapancha for me is in, it's not just me reading those views or taking them on. It's me getting wound up by them and feeling like I need to basically demolish them, rationally demolish those views. And so that's something I kind of carry around with me during the day. Like, okay, if someone says that, then I'd say this, and then the sort of sparring with the imaginary interlocutors of the internet. And certainly there's no shortage of raw material for that kind of prapancha. And even, I mean, it's not like I engage particularly much with those ideas in situ, i.e. on the internet fora. But I do kind of write pieces which then I don't publish, just conducting research, doing reading around those subjects in order to, at some point, I imagine, kind of hold forth and wow whoever it is with my very erudite and well worked out views. So there's a fair amount of ego in there as well. And then the third prapancha that is particularly particularly salient or particularly relevant for me at the moment is the prapancha of work. And Manjavajra mentioned I do a lot of work with the Young Buddhist Project, which involves a lot of meetings, both in person, online, a lot of email communications, strategic thinking, organising events, running events, giving talks and that kind of thing. Which is all good stuff in itself, but it's often the way I conduct that work, which is trying to keep several things going at the same time. I mean, in the case of communication, particularly, I'll be messaging someone on Facebook, and then while I'm waiting for them to respond, I'll be messaging somebody else on WhatsApp, and so I'll be kind of really enjoying the buzz of that kind of activity, but in a way, it's a very very kind of superficial busyness, which detracts from the deeper ways I can contribute. Does any of that sound familiar? Yeah. Okay. No, Sangadora, no. Okay, so I'll say a bit about actually how I'm working with these, and in a way how I translate some of the thinking from the Dhutangas of the Visuddhimagga into the arena of these prapanchas. So in relation to, maybe I'll start with the prapancha of work. So in relation to that, there's, I guess you could say, there's a few grades of that. So one grade might be just doing one task at a time. If you could call this sort of Dhutanga of do not disturb, just doing one thing and actually doing it well and being able to concentrate and think about it as I'm doing it. But then also, and this is in a way progressively harder, there's the Dhutanga of the gaps between tasks, and even the Dhutanga of doing nothing, which I find very difficult indeed. The sort of setting aside time every day in which to just let things completely settle, and then actually the depth sort of arises out of that. Then, in relation to views, there's the Dhutanga of reducing input or lowering my input. So actually, I don't at the moment. I'm not engaging all that much at all with online fora. And by the way, I'm not just talking about Buddhist stuff. I'm talking about comment sections, Reddit, subreddits, all that sort of thing as well. I'm very much reducing that kind of input. But also trying to transfer my attention more towards material which is kind of long form, like books. You could say that there's a Dhutanga of offline input, and even the Dhutanga of just one book at a time, which is something I don't find very easy either. Having several things on the go. And also in relation to views, there's something about trying to work out how to engage skillfully with those views, how to engage skillfully in that kind of communication, which I think involves as much an appreciation and an awareness of other people in a face-to-face environment as it does nutting out what the logical implications of their views are or where they might come from. And that's something I'm really interested in exploring more. And then with regard to the Prajnaketu of health, this is probably one I've struggled most with. But I've basically had to take precepts on things like no more exercise-related purchases, and just being very clear when I go onto YouTube, like what is it I'm looking at, and not being, it's just like it's a buffet, isn't it? And not being distracted by the up next or recommended for you or whatever, But I think probably more fundamental than that, or underneath that, is it's something about the way I identify myself as a consumer, and even a view that, progress looks like the accumulation of material goods. Yeah, so in a way, it's kind of obvious with regard to exercise that isn't the case, and certainly with regard to most of what we're doing under the auspices of spiritual practice. But that seems to be quite deep-seated for me. This view that progress means a sort of accumulation or a proliferation of gear. Yeah. Okay, so those are. I mean, you can talk about this in the discussion groups. Those are some of the ways I've attempted to work with, those three prapanchas. But I continue to find it difficult. It continues to be something which comes up in my chapter, and bless him, Padmakumara and Stiradeva have to hear, similar confessions in relation to different aspects of these same themes coming up again and again. And the way I'm coming to relate to why I find that difficult is, I'm calling the two maras. Yeah. So, the first mara is the mara of intoxication. And in a way, this is so obvious that he's almost not quite a Mara. It's kind of compulsive craving for particular experiences. Whether there are more views or more exercise gear, or this hope of extending youth beyond its natural course. But yeah, in a way, that's a kind of easier Mara to spot. It's not so much like, I see you, Mara, as I see you, Mara, and we're still on for next Tuesday, and give my best to your daughters, kind of thing. It's just so obvious that that's not a spiritual thing to be doing. The accumulation of that gear and what have you is that prapancha is not a spiritual thing. But I think there's a more insidious Mara. I think there's a more kind of crafty, cunning Mara, which is the Mara of respectable altruism. The Mara of respectable altruism. And so this will require a bit of going into, but I think all of those three things, the prapancha of health, the views of work, one of the reasons why I'm stuck in them is because I'm subscribing to the idea that they're worthy things to be involved in. Respectable altruism I would define as responding to the needs of the world on the terms of the world. And you kind of get praised for it, don't you? If I was a kind of right view warrior, if such a thing existed, there would be people who would back me up and say, yeah, you're doing absolutely the right thing in tearing down that view in that forum or whatever. And at the same, so it's kind of speciously bodhisattva activity, isn't it? And I think it's true with all of these. With with this Prapancha of health, like the respectable attitude is, I need to be kind to myself. I need to look after myself in order to be able to act altruistically. So, maybe I do need that wall-mounted chin-up bar after all, or that additional kind of protein shake or whatever, because it enables me physically to be well, and then I can be, of greater benefit to the world. And then, there's another way that respectable altruism might manifest is in staying relevant. There's definitely something kind of worthy and respectable about Buddhism not becoming irrelevant. So therefore, I must watch lots of YouTube and download lots of PDFs and find out what all the views are in the world at the moment and have a, as it were, dharmic perspective on them. And then, in a way, a kind of similar thing is avoiding passivity and avoiding quietism, which, at least with a lot of the younger people I encounter within, who are sort of getting involved with Buddhism, that's something that they're really keen not to be guilty of, is of being kind of passive, because Buddhism seems to have this reputation, or at least this reputation of having the danger of being too passive or too quietist. So, in other words, there's really respectable, really good reasons for getting caught up in the world on its own terms. And I think we need a critique of that, actually. I'm not going to be able to effect that critique in this talk particularly, but I will say a couple of things. I think the other thing is so just going back to this idea of two maras. The mara of intoxication is, it's obviously wrong, but the mara of respectable altruism is issuing moral imperatives, and I think that's what makes him that much more insidious, and that much kind of harder to even recognise and to stand aside from. But yeah, I've got two. Basically, I'm going to leave you with two thoughts on this, two contentions of mine, and see what you think about them. So the first is that I believe it's an elite undertaking to be in the world but not of the world. To be able to engage with all of those things, whether it's views, activity, kind of whatever, calisthenics, to be able to engage with all of that without kind of getting sucked into a worldly attitude towards them, I think is quite a high level achievement, and certainly for myself, I'm if anything rather blasé in relation to all that. And I've had to do a lot of learning in realising no, I'm not. I'm not kind of good enough in a way to be able to enter into some of those domains and still keep my head. So I would call it an elite undertaking to engage with the world, but without being of the world, and it's very easy to kid ourselves with that. And then the second contention is that those individuals throughout history who have been able to do that, who have been able to enter into the world but not be of the world, the people whose kind of altruistic impact, whose positive influence on the world has resounded down the centuries, even down the millennia. It strikes me that all of them have, within their lives, had a substantial component of solitude, of seclusion, of withdrawal. I just think it's mad that I know about Milarepa. Isn't that incredible? You got a kind of a hermit who's in the mountains who hardly sees anyone throughout a lot of his adult life. 11th century, I think it's 11th century, and yet we know about him, and he's influencing this gathering. He's influencing our order. He's even influencing a wider world. So there's something about the kind of impact that you can have on the basis of withdrawal. The kind of impact that's possible on the basis of that solitude. I mean, Amlavajra and I were talking about yesterday. I think we can name between us two figures from the 11th century, other than Milarepa. William the Conqueror and Harold Hardrada, I think, were the two we came up with. So that, you know, and those are like, you know, big geopolitical figures. Milarepa was basically on his own for most of his life, and yet, you know, in a way, who's had the greater impact on human history, and who will continue to have the greater impact on human history? So yeah, they've those individuals who've managed to make that kind of impact, have that positive impact. They haven't been kind of busying themselves, if you like, with the world issues of the day, and yet their impact, as I say, resounds. Now, I'm aware for myself that I've got a long way to go before getting to the point where I'm able to be in the world but not of the world. You know, I've got particularly a lot more withdrawal to do, and the depth out of that to come. And I'd cheekily say, well, the same is true for all of us. The same is true for you as well. It's not easy to be in the world and not of the world, and I think that's like the core of the Dharmacharya, and that's what we need to be engaging with. Okay, thank you.